Welcome back, everyone. Day three. This is for the recording here. Day three of the course on post-colonial eco-criticism. This is lecture 7. So the first lecture for today. And simply broadly titled Caribbean and African Anti-Colonial and National Voices. That covers a lot. But hopefully we'll get some specificity here as well. I will show in just a few minutes, couple of minutes, two images, but we'll get to that. I just wanted to let you be aware of that. So some of this is review for some of you, but if you're new to post-colonial criticism, I think it's useful to have this background. The Caribbean is made up of, as you know, many islands with different languages. Some of them still are protectorates. They use different terms, of France, the Netherlands, Great Britain, the US. So you see the vestiges of colonialism. But because they speak different languages, sometimes that can create a challenge in terms of how we translate these, and also in how they do look at, because language is so influential and cultural, it can affect how they look at the world. So keep that in mind. One thing they all share in the Caribbean, despite their differences, is that they are keenly aware of themselves as relatively fragile, precarious islands. Fragile environmentally because of storms, as you know. Hurricane, what we call, say, typhoon, it's pretty much the same thing. And they endure so much devastation. They also vary in how they are treated. Puerto Rico, which has come close to voting for independence once, is still treated as a second-class territory by the US, despite having a military base there, despite very influential Puerto Rican Americans, like Lin-Manuel Miranda in the arts, for example, and many writers. So the other fact is perhaps obvious that many of these Caribbean writers have either lived overseas or have gone back and forth between the home countries, as it were, and their own countries. So they also have a perspective of their fragile island in the world. So they have a global cosmopolitan perspective, if you remember that term. Some who stay in the islands then may criticize that, understandably. Nevertheless, I think they offer us an interesting perspective. So a group of scholars, intellectuals, and they were students at the time, from the island of Martinique, which is still not entirely independent. It is semi-autonomous from France. When they went to Paris to study on scholarships in the 1920s and 30s, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, later on the second generation, Edouard Glissant, they, with someone from West Africa named Léopold Senghor, who, so we don't have just the Caribbean, I should add. I'm focusing on the Caribbean momentarily. But they also had people from West Africa who became influential politicians. They all got together at the Sorbonne in France, and this first generation, and created a movement called Negritude. Negritude. It's usually spelled with an accent, aigu, so it's negritude, but you can use the English. It's just become part of the post-colonial language. So in addition to all the concepts we've been talking about in post-colonialism and environmentalism, we should remember that there have been distinct movements, self-conscious movements of certain groups of writers. Some writers do not want to be attached to a movement, understandably, right? But this means a movement tends to be politically driven as well. they all happen to be eloquent writers to the extent that one of them, Aimé Césaire, became the first black member of the Académie Française, means the like comparable to the Royal Academy of Arts, right? So that was many years later, but still. Um, Basically, négritude means blackness. So it was taking ownership of the racism, right? And saying we're going to own it, and we're going, just like say Dalit is doing that, and same patterns in many parts of the world. In Africa, we'll talk about African American later, and the cross cult, fertilization. But basically, just staying with the Caribbean, we also have. It was mostly men who got the scholarships. There was a woman, and I just learned this myself, named Jane Nardal, who in a 1929 article, Internationalisme Noir, meaning international, black internationalism, she influenced Senghor, but that got erased from history because she was a woman. Right? Not just by them, but even by the Western Academy. I just put that as a footnote to say that there's much work to be done in uncovering some of these progenitors. More to the point, I think Aimé Césaire actually helped coin the term, and he is, of course, a very famous sort of intellectual in post-colonial circles, as well as a writer, a poet. There was also someone who's less known today, Léon Damas of French Guiana, right? So we have all these interesting cross-fertilizations. Négritude encompasses both the practice of writing and critical theory as forms of activism. So you can see the intentional, because they're all from colonized countries, and they're treated as second-class citizens. So we were talking yesterday, I think someone mentioned, when you how can you not be political if you are in a colonized situation? And I think that's true. The movement, which also came after, just very shortly after the Harlem Renaissance, which I'll get to, from New York City in the 1920s and on, it arose it's not coincidental that these issues, these movements arose, and this Renaissance happened at this particular time, because this is a time when more and more colonized people in the Caribbean, I mean, and also African Americans after slavery, have become now educated, have started their own institutions perhaps, and so now they are at the beginning of the 20th century having this voice. There's been some criticism of négritude. Actually was very powerful for a time, and then it was not as well known. When I was in graduate school 30 years ago, it was there, it was important as a historical fact, but it wasn't seen as current, right? It was seen as, by some African Americans, as unnecessarily continuing the attention on race, on blackness, things like that. And there were other criticisms. One South African writer and activist, black activist, argued that the movement derived from a European view of aesthetics. So we'll talk about that today. So some have argued for a more militant movement, right? Now, I can't speak to writerly or non-literary movements like the ANC, because those are those are actually movements that were not self-consciously about the arts, if you will. So there are the militant aspects. So it's interesting when you combine militancy with writing. And yesterday we were talking about Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, which I'll get to in a few minutes, saying that violence is unavoidable, right? So you do get these strains from writers, and thinkers. The great Nigerian writers Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka have been the greatest critics of negritude because they argue, or argued, since Achebe died a few years ago, that it implies that black artists are defensive about their work, that they have something to prove. Now, I think, from all I've read, I think sometimes you have to be proactive and make a case for yourself, right? Strategic essentialism. You have to go out. But I think from their point of view, as slightly next generation of writers, they felt it was no longer necessary. But that's only their view. What's interesting is negritude has been revived in just the last few years as a focus of academic study in new ways, right? And it, perhaps also revived in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, a kind of global recognition of, in Europe as well. They've been later coming to account for their legacy. Just one couple more things about this negritude to give us an overview of where these specific writers are coming from that I assigned. A couple more things. There's an African diasporic intellectual academic who died about 8 years ago, named Abiola Irele, Irele, a Nigerian, who was a big proponent of negritude. And his work, it's through renewed attention to his work that we get more of this, if you're interested in following that up. So why Martinique also? Why the Caribbean? There are several reasons. The three writers and theorists whose works I'm focusing on and asked you to look at, or if you haven't, afterwards, happen to all be from Martinique. That's not, I mean, we will look at writers from other parts of the Caribbean, but these are the ones who have informed post-colonial critique a great deal. It's interesting that they're from Martinique, right? Here's the term for, instead of protectorate, the French call it département, a department. Although France has since the 1940s responded to the call by a majority of the 350,000 people in Martinique for independence, by allowing more autonomy, it's still not independent. Tensions occasionally still arise. So we are still with this, right? If you look at the news, it doesn't make world news always because of their tiny islands, right? The media likes to talk about the big countries, right? But the tensions flared when a small proportion of the European settler population, there's only 5% any left of the European blood, but they've been there for generations. But that's an interesting dynamic, and they're economically better off. And generally, the 80% of those with African heritage, 80% on average, tend to be less better off. So these tensions flare up, obviously, right? Just in 2023. The island's government adopted a new flag with 3 colors, red, green, and black, that symbolize Pan-Africanism. Like, we're not letting go of this, right? So they're still fighting this battle. 10% of Martinique is of Indian descent, South Asian descent. We don't often hear about Mauritius, perhaps, and some other countries, or Guyana in South America, and Trinidad and Tobago, but perhaps not as much about Martinique. So, if I could show, Ankita, those 2 images, black and white. So these are just, the first one, thank you, is a 1588 image engraving, which as a lithograph, of a Spanish galleon, a type of ship, right, that has been shipwrecked. Uh, and the reason I could have chosen any number of images. That's because shipwreck is a big, an important motif for many Caribbean writers. Self-conscious motif, they use it as a metaphor. So Derek Walcott, who's from St. Lucia, who writes in English, won the Nobel Prize. His book of poetry called Omeros has many shipwreck themes. Of course, many other works of classic literature have shipwreck themes, Daniel Defoe. But this is, what I'm getting to is, this is different for the African diaspora, who see shipwreck as a symbol, a metaphor of how they got there, right? They were brought by ships as slaves. And also, metaphorically, out of that wreckage of a shipwreck, you create something new. You survived. So the survivors of shipwreck. The ocean and islands obviously are big motifs. And as I mentioned yesterday, if you're interested, I'm not covering that in this course, but the idea of Indian Ocean studies, the Black Atlantic, all together collectively, perhaps called the Blue Humanities, is a big trend today. But they have been writing about this for a long time. And so I want you to keep shipwreck in mind. Then the other image is, you may have seen this as well because it's often reproduced. This is Allegory of America. It created in somewhere between 1600 and 1620. So this is supposed to be Amerigo Vespucci, who gave the name America to America. He never went there, but yeah. The Italian map maker, who he was a great map maker, but anyway, the Allegory of America, and there's Vespucci all overdressed, I would say, talking to a naked Native American. And this is, as you know, a classic kind of mythos, mythography, whatever you want to call it, of Europe viewing the New World. The noble savage, right? On one hand, it's a very idyllic image. You have, they're reclining on a hammock, right? It's like they're on permanent vacation, permanent holiday. But Vespucci has the emblems of knowledge, right? The sextant. He's got a flag, right? And some comedians have made a lot of fun of that, right? This idea that, the flag means you're more civilized, right? The Gillian is in the background, right? So Vespucci, of course, is Italian, but so was Columbus, and they all sailed for different countries. The bottom line is, this image was very powerful, and a lot of post-colonial scholars have talked about it, including Peter Hume, Hulme, who writes about South America and the Caribbean. Anya Lumba, in her introductory text, which is a very clear and good introduction, Colonialism, Post-Colonialism, talks about it. So many people talk about it. It doesn't mean that's the only image, but it does come from a time period, a contemporary, when, if you think of the Caribbean, this is kind of the image they had, even though the conditions in the Caribbean by then were very, very harsh, right? To the point where the indigenous people almost became extinct. So the word Caribbean comes from Carib or Carib, who are an indigenous people that were basically wiped out by disease and slavery. But there are descendants of them in Puerto Rico and other places who have some Carib blood still, and they still continue some traditions. They were doing this in secret. It was rediscovered much later. So I wanted to leave those two images. Thank you, Ankita. and just in your mind. These are what, in a sense, Aimé Césaire and these writers are responding to, starting way back in the 1940s, right? Although, as I said, Glissant, and then later we'll see Derek Walcott, are a later generation. So Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism, originally written in French, translated almost immediately in 1950. He was the elder statesman of Martinican independence. He also was a politician. And Lumba, in her introduction, observes that for many intellectuals and writers who were challenging colonial rule in the first half of the 20th century, Marxism was persuasive. So they tend to have Marxist impulses. They do criticize Marxism on one end, though, and that is it never, the original Marx, right? Marx himself, perhaps, never talks about race, right? So they bring that quotient in. And then later on, a criticism of Fanon and Césaire is they don't usually talk about women. So that's another thing. Colonialism as capitalism, right? Capitalism as colonialism. Interconnected. That's what they talked about a lot in their intellectual writings. She notes that Césaire's moving and powerful discourse on colonialism indicts colonial brutality in terms that are clearly inflected by Marxist analysis. Marx emphasized that under capitalism, money and commodities we're familiar with this, begin to stand in for human relations and alienation, objectifying humans. Similarly, so we have that. Similarly, Césaire claims that colonialism not only exploits but dehumanizes and objectifies the colonized subject, but it also degrades the colonizer. The same point that Ashish Nandi makes in The Intimate Enemy. Not to the same degree, right? You can't equate them, but you are corrupting yourself in the process. And he has a famous term called thingification. That's the English translation, right? Basically, as dehumanized as you can get, just an object. So let's see. The other thing they did was not just attack and criticize Europe, but defend non-European traditions and civilizations. So it's not just a proactive attack. It is also at the same time trying to advocate for their own traditions. Now, it's challenging if your own tradition has already been creolized, one that's Creole. So that's the same challenge that African Americans have faced. With what ideas do I identify? How do I see myself? That sort of thing. But language is a key, and so language, for example, all of them spoke Creole in their home. Many, I don't know if all, but most of them, which is a pidgin language, whatever linguists would call it. So a Creole language, a mix of French and other dialects. Some of the words coming from Africa still. At the same time, though, these were the educated few at the time. They wrote in French, right? So now we know that sentiment happens in India too, right? With it was in the 1930s that Raja Rao talked about that, right? Why do I write in English? So we can talk more about that if you're interested. A key feature of their work is that they push the analysis of colonialism into the realm of the psychology, and the subjectivity of colonized people. So that's another thing, that although Marx did a great service of making words like alienation important, right? He was not a psychologist, though there are a lot of implications there. But they now are trained, and psychology was a very nascent, a sort of not a very developed science in Marx's day. They, however, take that and go. So Fanon was a psychiatrist trained at the Sorbonne. So we'll talk about that. For example, in Black Skin, White Masks, he defines colonized people as not simply those whose labor had been appropriated, but those, quote unquote, in whose soul an inferiority complex had been created by the death and burial of its local cultural originality. Right? We're familiar with this perhaps, but in the 1950s, he wrote this in the late 1950s or thereabouts, pretty radical stuff. And he also garnered a preface or introduction, I can't remember what it was, by Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre, the famous philosopher. I'll just read a couple of excerpts from a discourse on colonialism. This one is from 1972 translation by Joan Pinkham. First, we must study how colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism. You can see he's a writer, right? He's rhetorical. I would love to read this in French, but that's fun. And we must show that each time a head is cut off or an eye put out in Vietnam and in France, by the way, this is before it was already bad because the French were colonizing Vietnam. Indochine, they called it. And, they got infamously defeated there. So that's what he's referring to. Every time the head is cut off or an eye put out, they accept the fact each time a little girl is raped, and in France they accept the fact each time a Madagascan is tortured, and in France they accept the fact. Each time that happens and they accept the fact, civilization acquires another dead weight, a universal regression takes place, a gangrene sets in, a center of infection begins to spread. And that at the end of all these treaties that have been violated, all these lies that have been propagated, all these punitive expeditions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners who have been tied up and interrogated, all these patriots who have been tortured, at the end of all, the racial pride has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that has been displayed, a poison has been instilled into the veins of Europe. And slowly but surely, the continent proceeds towards savagery. What's interesting is he wrote this after World War II. So he made a controversial statement, not in this exact words, but to the effect that the Holocaust was partly a sign of the chickens coming home to roost, because confinement like that had actually been perpetrated in the Americas, right, of Native Americans in the 1870s, was still done by the British in Kenya in the 1950s, right? Not to the extent of gas chambers, but still rounding up young men, innocent, just because they might rebel, or whole families, and so on. So this was hard-hitting, and you can see why a lot of your French people didn't like this at the time, right? Let me just read this other section that it brings in the Nazism. People are surprised. They become indignant. They say, how strange, but never mind, it's Nazism, it'll pass. And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves. And this he includes the colonized people too, sometimes. Just, well, it'll pass, right? But the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that is Nazism, yes. But that before they were victims, they were its accomplices. They tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, and they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then, it had been applied only to non-European people. So this had been going on, but no one called attention to it. And of course, he's condemning the Holocaust. We shouldn't say he's saying, what he means is obviously that only when it was inflicted on its own people, on of course, the Nazis saw them as different, but I mean, generally speaking, they were Europeans. Only when it's inflicted within their borders does the world pay attention. So I could read more, but I'll just read a couple of statements. He also has a number of lines that are each a paragraph, so it's poetic in a sense. He has an interesting text called "Journal of My." I think in English it's "Journal of the Return to My Native Land." La retour au pays natal. So the return to my native land. He says, a civilization that proves incapable of solving the problems it creates is a decadent civilization. Just like aphorisms. A civilization that chooses to close its eyes to its most crucial problems, is a stricken civilization. And a civilization that uses its principles for trickery and deceit is a dying civilization. Decadent, stricken, dying. So clear images of the body, that's interesting, right? The body politic, as it were, infected, dying, interesting images, right? So I'll leave that sort of quick introduction to Césaire there for now and turn to Frantz Fanon. He wrote The Wretched of the Earth in 1961, but as I said, he had already written Black Skin, White Mask, which was both actually books came out of his experience treating the victims on the Algerian side of the Algerian Civil War against France. Because he was a psychiatrist, so he was treating what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. And he could see that already, he was amazingly, perceptive. Already you're traumatized from colonialism. Now, if you go into battle, that's a separate kind. It has its own trauma. So all these layers are what he was faced with. If you're interested in that. Like Césaire, he was, as I said, educated at Sorbonne as a psychiatrist. His English publisher, which is still publishes it, it's called the Grove Press, which has published some great books, rightly describes it as, quote, an eternal touchstone for civil rights, anti-colonialism, psychiatric studies, and Black consciousness movements around the world. This book was, as I learned many years later in college, was apparently very popular in the West and went through many reprintings during the 1960s and early 70s. The civil rights struggle, I don't know if you know, but in 1968 there were student movements all around the world. Paris, Mexico, where they killed many, the US to some degree, and different parts of the world. So this was kind of the generation awakening who had been born during World War II or right after it, and didn't like what they saw. Right. So this was the book that they all read. He took the title, I thought this was interesting, he took the title of the book from an 1871 French Marxist anthem. Now, the anthem is famous. It's called the International, the International, whose first stanza in English is this. And this is an old-fashioned translation that's still used. Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, arise, ye wretched of the earth, for justice thunders condemnation, a better world's in birth. No more traditions' chains shall bind us, arise, ye slaves, no more in thrall. The earth shall rise on new foundations. We have been naught, we shall be all. But written not with an eye to non-Europeans, right? So he's shrewd. He's taking the title from a Marxist anthem that's very famous and still used and was put to music later. And then applies it to the wretched of the earth, right? I love these intertextual connections. As we mentioned, things fall apart coming from Yeats. We'll get to, I'm going to repeat myself now later, but Tsitsi Dangaremga's nervous conditions novel. She was also a trained psychologist, she's still writing, and she takes her title nervous conditions from Fanon. So I love these, connections. They clue you into where the writer is coming from. But getting back to his title, it shows his willingness to also take from European thought that what was useful. So it's not saying it's important to talk about, as we did yesterday briefly in the question and Q&A. I think this is a very important topic as to what degree do we still use European, constructs. For example, we know Freudianism is not totally, some of it is off. It's very male-centered and so forth. Give us some important language to use. So in the same way, I think that's an important point to keep in mind. But they did take what they learned from the Sorbonne, from the metropole, fancy word for the very center, a city, of course, but the very center of the empire. Even though France didn't call itself an empire, of course. He draws, therefore, on psychoanalysis and Marxism, as I said, and he analyzes the trauma of colonialism and racism. Early in the book, he has the chapter we were talking yesterday as well on violence. By stating that decolonization is always a violent event. Now, some people interpret that as, yes, it could be physically violent, but it could be mentally. And I think he did mean it both ways, but he clearly also meant physically. That is, because after all, colonialism is violent. So to unwrap it, to undo it, sometimes he advocated violence, just like the ANC in South Africa, for example. It is the colonist who fabricated and continues to fabricate the colonized subject. The colonist derives his validity, his wealth, from the colonial system. That's very much Marxist. But see, I'm going to read one famous passage very close to the beginning of the book. And if you haven't read it, you can see now how clearly it's written. And so this is what he says. The colonial world is a compartmentalized world. It's translated in different ways, like in two different translations. It is obviously as superfluous to recall the existence of native towns and European towns, of schools for natives and schools for European, as it is to recall apartheid in South Africa. Yet if we penetrate inside this compartmentalization, we shall at least bring to light some of its key aspects. Oh, am I talking loud enough? Oh, good. By penetrating its geographical configuration and classification, we shall be able to delineate the backbone on which the decolonized society is reorganized. The colonized world, this is the more famous phrase, is a world divided in two. The dividing line, the border, is represented by the barracks and the police stations. Discourse? In the colonies, the official legitimate agent, the spokesperson for the colonizer in the regime of oppression is the police officer or the soldier. In capitalist societies, education, whether secular or religious, the teaching of moral reflexes handed down from father to son, interesting gender, the exemplary integrity of workers decorated after 50 years of loyal and faithful service, the fostering of love for harmony and wisdom, those aesthetic forms of respect for the status quo instill in the exploited a mood of submission and inhibition which considerably eases the tasks of the agents of law and order. In capitalist countries, a multitude of sermonizers, counselors, and confusion mongers, agents provocateurs is the French term, agents who provoke. You would plant, it's similar to that, right? And so they would, like, you want to create a riot, right? Like the Americans did, because the British asked them to in Iran in 1950, right? You start a rebellion. In colonial regimes, however, the proximity and frequent direct intervention by the police and the military ensure the colonized are kept under close scrutiny and contained by rifle butts and napalm. This was before the American use of it, right? We have seen how the government's agent uses a language of pure violence. Interesting, right? The agent does not alleviate oppression or mask domination. He displays and demonstrates them with the clear conscience of the law enforcer and brings violence into the homes and minds of the colonized subject. That's pretty powerful, right? Long paragraph, powerful. Also good if you were going to teach it to younger students. It can be controversial for some listeners. For example, my students, in Idaho. But once you talk about the fact, you draw the analogy between this and other kinds of oppression, right? That they're familiar with, that students are familiar with, or we are. I always say that's how we make those bridges to make it matter. Otherwise, it's sort of abstract. This happened a long time ago, but no, it still happens, right? So. I was going to say something else. So the other thing is the idea of uniforms and ritual. When you ritualize things, it's a healthy thing. We're human animals. We need ritual. I'm not an anthropologist, but that's I'll say that. And that's true, right? We need ritual. But you can use it to bad ends, like the Nazis did, right? Or the colonial regimes did. So you can make people, it's fascinating to study this psychologically, to say ordinary people can do bad things, right? Anyone heard of the Stanford prison experiment? Yes. What's that? Yeah. Right. So if you're interested, check with them. That shows that you could not do that today because you'd be sued. But it shows how ordinary people can so easily do bad things because they are behind an alibi or they are seen, you kind of feel like you're performing something on the behest of something else, right? Well, this is a means to an end. I'm wearing a uniform, So it's not that uniforms are bad. That's not the point, right? It's just that it can be used in a bad way. So I'll just read one more section, then that's all from wow, time's going, from Pano. The native sector is not complementary to the European sector. The two confront each other, but not in the service of a higher unity. Governed by a purely Aristotelian logic, interesting, they follow the dictates of mutual exclusion. There's no conciliation possible. In India, the British used to use the term, until about the middle of the 1800s, they used the term black town. And then sometimes white, but also European. They use different terms for the other one. And it's pretty stark, right? So then he says, it's a sector of lights and paved roads where the trash cans constantly overflow with strange and wonderful garbage. Undreamed of leftovers. The colonists' feet can never be glimpsed except perhaps in the sea, but then you can never get close enough. You're not allowed on the beaches. They are protected by solid shoes in a sector where the streets are clean and smooth, without a pothole, without a stone. The colonist sector is a stated sluggish sector. Its belly is permanently full of good things. The colonist sector is a white folk sector, a sector of foreigners. This sounds like someone who's angry and has lived through this, right? This is, just the anger. And now he's getting it published. It must have been a thrill, right? Even if he doesn't know what effect it's going to have. It's also interesting on a level of writing. I think he's such a good writer because he knows instinctively, and that's why the book has been in print constantly, is he fixes on specific images that anyone can understand. A pothole, stone, the sea garbage, things that are pretty easy to understand, um, which create this ethos, or atmosphere, I should say, of tension. And then he says the colonized sector, as you can imagine, is going to be the opposite, or at least the native quarters, the shanty town, the Medina, the reservation, whatever you call it, right? He's naming all the sectors around the. It's interesting, if you go to Morocco and places, they still have the Medina, but the Medina now is not the same as the Medina back then. It's the old quarters, but when the Europeans colonized, they kind of kept everyone there, right? So during the Algerian Civil War, the Medina, well, there's another name too we could talk about, but the Medina becomes sort of associated as the closed, place. Now, if you go to Morocco, it's become very touristy, so that's interesting. The Kasbah is the other word I'm thinking of that was used specifically in North Africa as well, for where the local uh, population lived. Incidentally, this is not unrelated to literary works, because famous writers like Albert Camus, even Jacques Derrida, these were French people born in Algeria. Uh, yeah, and some were Jewish, some were not. The point was that we forget that, and they called themselves pieds noirs, but they were also, pieds noirs means black feet, as if you're a bit tainted by having been born. Isn't that crazy? And then they kind of took ownership. Okay, we'll call ourselves that. But it's interesting that Derrida never mentioned it a whole lot. Camus wrote a book called The Plague, which is very timely, which is set in in Algeria. Uh, Lumba says that Fanon maps race and class divisions onto one another, but such mapping is extremely difficult to grasp in all its complexity, right? Without an understanding of race. And that's where Fanon's contribution comes in. She says, and some of this is pretty obvious. In the colonies, as the Prime Minister of Cape Colony remarked in 1908, white workers were, quote, delighted on arrival to find themselves in a position of an aristocracy of color, unquote. So you could be like very low on the totem pole in Europe. You could be Irish. And if you're coming here to a colonial situation, you suddenly, right, feel like you're empowered. In highlighting Fanon's then original idea, combination of Marxism and psychoanalysis, we should also keep in mind, as Lumba says, which are two key components of post-colonialism still. There's another one, which is, of course, feminism. As I mentioned, that these writers did not mention that, right? Sexuality. They were using it as if a matter of course. The black man, this is how Fanon talks about it. But I think we have, of course, first the French feminists, if you're interested, Julia Kristeva, who talks about the abject, and Hélène Cixous, who's a writer, creative writer as well, but also then slightly younger generation of Gayatri Spivak and Rajeshwari Sundarajan, who have imbibed some of these ideas. I'm just mentioning a couple of names, right? Who read Fanon, Césaire, and these writers, sometimes in the original, as Spivak does in French. So let me say this. Why do I mention some of those writers? Because some of them are associated with the as you know, the literary criticism called deconstruction. And in a way, they provided, arguably, along with some other thinkers, and these are non-Europeans, right? So they, in a way, provided the tools, critical tools, with which to expose and then deconstruct colonial discourse. And so we should remember that. I think I lost my... Yeah. Oh, now we turn to Edouard Glissant, and I hope I'm on the right track. Yes. We still have lots to talk about. We have 3 hours, right, for the first lecture? No. Um, so I'm just joking, just seeing if you're awake. But if we look at Edouard Glissant, who, as I said, he was still writing in the 2000s. I don't know what the latest is, but so he's a younger generation, and he writes in French, right, as do the others. Rob Nixon has argued about 20 years ago in an essay which I've cited called "Environmentalism and Postcolonialism," which was one of the early essays in this field, that we need a transnational ethics of place that recognizes the need for people to sustain their ties to particular landscapes while also recognizing, so you have your own landscape particular, but also recognizing the effects of people's displacement as a result of colonialism. So diaspora, right? Home. They are always in imagined and written about in light of one another. It's interesting how often, by the way, I hadn't written this down, but how often nationalism has been crystallized or seen clearly by writers and thinkers in exile. You know? And why, even if they're not nationalists, why do they leave? Like, of course, we know Gandhi and Dada Nauroji and others in London. That's where Gandhi hears a lecture, ironically. Oh, you know. But we also have writers like James Joyce and many others who leave their island countries, right? Island is important here, and have a love-hate relationship with it. So I just thought that was interesting. Glissant, George Handley, who's written about, he teaches not far from where I live, who's written about Glissant's writings, argues that Glissant has, this is a quote, perhaps better than any other recent theorist, conceptualized space in relation to colonial history in a way that serves to harmonize the aims of post-colonialism and eco-criticism. So Glissant's a name you'll hear a lot of more and more for his thinking. His poetry, to be honest, is I find it a bit obscure, a bit obtuse, perhaps. I mean, it's challenging. It's written in French, so I can't judge, perhaps. But I think his essays are more eloquent. Handley cites post-colonial eco-critic Elizabeth Dulafree, her point that Glissant's understanding of diaspora offers a method of reading power relations through narratives of place and displacement. Another scholar, Sarah Castile, sees writers like Glissant as crafting this is an interesting term, a critical pastoralism. I know this becomes a lot of terminology, but I am going to give you snippets in the next lecture from their writings. A critical pastoralism in which nature is apprehended or understood simultaneously through the lenses of aesthetics and history. So remember we talked about Bankim Chandra as, on the one hand, having specific trees in mind and flora, and so, but on the same time, having an aesthetic or poetic, let's just say poetic sensibility. And I think we all understand that. We're in the literary community. But I think it's sort of similar to this that she's saying, but also that profound understanding of history and the importance of history. I like Handley's summarizing of Glissant's works, citing other scholars. So I'm just going to read this. Castile notes that in many of the writers of her study, such as Jamaica Kincaid, Maurice Condé, whom we're not going to read, but we are going to talk about Jamaica Kincaid, we see botanical imagery that no longer provides metaphors of stability or access to an ideology of stable singular roots, but rather of diversity and mixture. So the English garden, stable, quaint, right? The weather never changes, right? But then in Jamaica Kincaid's handling, she was a garden columnist, right? Or writer. When you're thinking of the Caribbean, it becomes something that is hybrid, that threatens the paradigms, this sort of presumably stable paradigms of European discourse. Delauffre suggests that diaspora theory has too easily assumed itself in opposition to identities founded on geography, because soil is too often seen as static, when environmentally speaking, it more often provides dynamic, historic, and shifting metaphors of culture that are anything but essentialist. So, in other words, um, sometimes diasporic, this was, I think, referring to maybe up until about 20 years ago, diasporic writers understandably might have seen themselves as um, providing a lens, and we can add to this people like Salman Rushdie, or I don't know about Jhumpa Lahiri, that's a different case, but many writers who had definitely are diasporic um, would sometimes look at the homeland as kind of static and, you know, not vital, lost some vitality, which was of course wrong. But she's saying this itself is a misguided view. So she talks about Kincaid, for example, they see an analogy between human and plant migration. That's interesting, right? Now, plant migration is as a result of the Columbian Exchange, right? Do you remember that? The Alfred Crosby's term. But it's also because of climate change. So plants are more moving northwards. Do you know that? They're also climbing mountains. As you know, that is to say, their habitat is changing, and so they've seen this very clearly evidence. What used to be, because as the planet warms, these plants migrate. So I don't know if she had that in mind, but I think that's an important way to read that. So then it begs the term of what we mean by emplacement, home, all those things, right? The other thing that Delauffre especially notes is the importance of ocean. Remember, we saw the shipwreck there, and the island. So island studies is a big area. University of Edinburgh Press has a series on that, which is fascinating to think about. So islands as actual geographical places, but also metaphorically. Michael Dash, in his introduction to Glissant's work, Caribbean Discourse, from which I had you read just a few things, selected essays, says that Glissant shifts our attention away from the conventional reduction of Caribbean history to a racial melodrama of revenge or remorse, and toward a close scrutiny of the obscurities, vicissitudes, and fissures that abound in Caribbean history from slavery to the present. So basically, it's an area, just to sum up where I started from, I just have another minute here. It's an area that of the world in which has particularly suffered the vicissitudes, the changes of climate or nature, as well as history, right? And each island is distinct, but they do share this kind of general outlook of being partly neglected by the world, but also they are therefore acutely perceptive about the issues that confront all of us today, which is, in a sense, displacement of one kind or another, right? Let me just end by saying that, because I didn't even get to Wole Soyinka, I know, but I want to end by saying that Derek Walcott in Omeros intentionally patterns it on the Odyssey, right, by Homer. And you may be thinking, Joyce did that, right, with Ulysses, but you may be thinking, why are these writers who are not English and see English education as that's where they learn about the Odyssey and all, which is not even English, but anyway, it was portrayed as sort of the canon of Western. Why go back to those? And I think one reason, there's for example, Franco Moretti has a book called Modern Epic, which is about modernism and the epic. And he's an Italian scholar at Stanford. But the idea is that you if you can change the very canons of the West and give us a different view, that's just as powerful, perhaps, for a broad readership as creating something totally new in that sense. So I'll stop there. Thank you. I think the hour is up. Thanks. That's the end of lecture 7.